I recently had the great honor of sitting down with a criminologist who, in my opinion, has written one of the most important and well-researched books of our time, Forbidden Facts. We jumped right into the heart of his latest research, and honestly, I was immediately taken aback. We all know about operations like Project Paperclip, where the U.S. brought over scientists working on bioweapons from Japan and Germany to start our own program, and of course the infamous MK Ultra and Project Mockingbird. But then he hit me with one I'd never heard of, Project Gladio. I was told to put my seatbelt on, and the story that unfolded completely blew my mind. This wasn't some long-debunked conspiracy theory. This information is available on Wikipedia. The guest explained that after World War II, the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, decided to leave hundreds of American soldiers behind in Europe. They were told to hide weapons, ammunition, and grenades in bunkers and just wait for instructions. Their original purpose was supposedly to fight communism and the Soviets, but what they ended up doing was committing terroristic incidents against our own allies. We are talking about our own CIA funding and operating an attack that blew up a train station in Bologna, injuring 285 people and killing 85. They were behind the 1989 assassination of a journalist who was writing about these incidents, shooting him twice in the head. There were other bombings, like the one at Oktoberfest in Germany, where 17 people were killed. Why would the U.S. do this? The guest argued that the goal was to create massive terrorist incidents that would frighten the public and push them toward voting for more right-leaning or totalitarian governments, regimes the CIA could work with, and away from any political movement that smelled like communism. This operation also included the kidnapping and assassination of Aldo Moro, a former prime minister, along with his 5 bodyguards. It was revealed that this was done by Project Gladio, an army that eventually swelled to 20,000 people across Europe. The most shocking part of the story for me was that it didn't end until 1990. The guest shared that the truth became so undeniable that terrorists who had been imprisoned for these incidents were eventually released because their defense was that the acts were actually done by the CIA. This whole insane operation brought us to the guest's central theme, the critical importance of oversight and public skepticism. I questioned if this whole thing was simply a precautionary measure that got completely out of hand because there was no oversight. The guest stressed that when power centers become centralized and operate without skepticism from the public, they run us rather than the other way around. He also pointed out that the United States rarely ends a war completely. Instead, we leave behind hundreds of thousands of troops in places like Germany, Japan, and South Korea, continuing these conflicts in more secret, dark versions like Gladio. The blurring of truth and reality is a huge issue today, and my guest pointed out that the lines were permanently smudged during the Obama administration with the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act, which made it legal to use propaganda on American citizens. It is now absolutely legal for intelligence agencies to lie to us in the interest of national security. We know that Project Mockingbird put hundreds of American journalists directly on the CIA payroll. The guest argued that even though the Church Committee supposedly shut it down, it just changed its name, because with all information being international, propaganda floated overseas inevitably makes its way to the U.S. He shared a fascinating anecdote from his own investigation into Saudi Arabia's misuse of Twitter, back when it was still Twitter, in 2018 to 2019, where they used bots and 40,000 paid users to get fake aggressive messages to trend virally. This is just an obvious strategy that every country uses. Narratives, whether it's the American myth of anyone becoming president, India's focus on the next life, or England's focus on the class structure to control their populations. The conversation then took a hard turn into the COVID-19 lockdowns. The guest began by observing that the U.S. government and governments around the world showed hostility toward the church during the pandemic, viewing it as a competing power center. In a strange contradiction, liquor stores and big box stores were deemed essential, while churches were forced to close. I pointed out that even outdoor dining and comedy shows were outlawed in Los Angeles. The guest's cynical but realistic conclusion was that division is the ultimate source of power. By preventing people from gathering for collective enjoyment at concerts on the beach, they prevented the sense of unity that transcends political judgment. I asked if he thought the lockdowns were done intentionally to divide, or if it was just performative public safety. He responded with his core criminologist principle: forget about figuring out what's in someone's head and just look at what actually happened. What actually happened was that every Western nation on earth put its citizens under house arrest, closing hundreds of thousands of businesses and fundamentally removing people's freedom. He argued that the lockdowns were as big an event as all the world wars put together, serving as a complete lesson in government control. To prove the point about intent, he brought up Event 2019, a tabletop exercise that took place in late 2019. Before the COVID virus was publicly known, this event, organized by Bill Gates, the CIA, the head of the Chinese CDC, and others, ran through what would happen in a pandemic. The critical detail, he noted, was that the entire discussion was about controlling information, not health. He stressed that you don't need a single meeting of mustache-twirling villains. You only need a system of aligned incentives. When an event happens, every entity, from a perfume sprayer manufacturer that now makes hand sanitizer to a bumper sticker company making stand 6 feet apart stickers, aligns toward the tyrannical outcome, because tyranny is the natural order for human beings throughout history. He then made an essential point that resonated with me deeply. The suffering he's experienced personally in recent years comes from his own resistance to letting go of the illusions we grew up with, that the courts will be fair, that the Constitution will always be followed, and that the government will respect our freedom. We have to be willing to accept the reality of the darkness, from Gladio to Operation Northwoods and MK Ultra, and recognize that no one ever got arrested or prosecuted for any of it. Most people, he observed, took the COVID shot simply to keep their jobs, travel, or visit loved ones. But they don't understand the depth of the power structure we are up against. This naturally led us to the AIDS pandemic. I was able to share my experience of having Dr. Peter Duesberg on my show years ago, which resulted in massive vitriolic pushback from people who accused me of having blood on my hands. The guest concurred with Duesberg's controversial but evidence-based assertion: HIV was a weak virus, a symptom, not the ultimate cause of AIDS. The original theory, supported by people like Fauci and Redfield, was that HIV was the absolute cause, even though the Nobel laureate who discovered HIV felt you could have one without the other. The guest posited that the darker reason for the high death toll was the massive overdosing on the drug, acetylazethymidine, which actually produced the symptoms that people were supposedly dying from. This kept the numbers going. I brought up the inconvenient fact that the vast majority of people with air quotes AIDS were hardcore drug users and partygoers whose immune systems were already crushed by continuous partying, drug use, and scooping handfuls of antibiotics at parties for infections. Duesberg and my guest pointed out that ACT was a chemotherapy medication that had to be stopped in cancer patients because it was killing them faster than the cancer was. Yet it was the only chemotherapy drug people were told to stay on for life, and when it was stopped, the number of deaths from AIDS decreased. I still can't get over the bizarre fact that the disease never really made a meaningful transition into the heterosexual community, despite it supposedly being an unbelievably contagious, sexually transmitted disease. I also reminded the guest of the great tennis player Arthur Ashe, who was asymptomatic, started ACT, and was dead within 6 months. My guest then shared a stunning story from his book about an American couple who adopted an HIV-positive little girl from Romania. Doctors immediately put the child on ACT, and she rapidly got worse, losing weight, unable to stand up. The parents were told this was just AIDS progressing, but they eventually reached out to Peter Duesberg, who bravely wrote back, "Take her off the medication immediately." The doctors predicted the child would be dead by age 7, but in the documentary House of Numbers, which my guest stressed viewers should look up the correct version of, the film cuts to that same girl, now 23 years old, healthy and pregnant with her own daughter. This led to the comparison with the present. You can be generous and say people didn't know things early in the COVID-19 pandemic, but it's impossible for the leaders of pharmaceutical companies now to claim they are unaware of issues like myocarditis causing sudden death in kids and athletes. The guest argued for applying the plane crash model to medicine. When a plane crashes, you don't say millions of passengers are fine and ignore the few hundred who died. You retrieve the black box and investigate the one tragedy extensively. In the pharma model, the millions who are fine are prioritized, while the few who suffer, the ones who need the research, are ignored. We then discussed the sheer financial incentive for pharmaceutical corporations to continue this cycle. Even when they are caught in wrongdoing, Eli Lilly made $40 billion on Zyprexa, despite paying out billions in settlements, and Vioxx made $12 billion in revenue and was fined $5 billion. In the last 31 years, my guest found that pharma manufacturers have paid $62 billion in fines, but they have made trillions. I noted that the main attack leveled against us for discussing these issues is that we are not doctors or not scientists, but my guest, a criminologist, simply speaks English and reads the publicly available data and citations to lay out the evidence. He mentioned how many people are shocked when he tells them that 99% of polio is asymptomatic. To put the potential for organized evil into perspective, he shared the story of the 1942 Wannsee Conference. This was where Hitler's top officials met with civilian government leaders to lay out the plan for the Jews. Initially, they used euphemisms like relocation camps, but after a few drinks, the euphemisms stopped, and the horrifying reality of their plan slowly began to drop for the civilian leaders. This story helps the guest remember that human beings absolutely get in a room and plan awful things. This kind of deliberate deception was also evident in a CDC panel discussing the MMR vaccine and autism. My guest shared quotes where the so-called scientific experts spent 6 days arguing not about the science, but about how to form the question itself. They were obsessed with introducing confusion and language that would avoid using the word causal in any conclusion, specifically because they feared that if they did, people would be afraid to take vaccines. Finally, we shifted to foreign policy, and the guest detailed the story of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who was quite literally an actor in a TV show. His campaign was financed by a key Ukrainian oligarch, and U.S. intelligence agencies like the CIA and NSA, alongside $5 billion in U.S. democracy campaign money, helped ensure his victory. After he won with 73% of the vote, he declared martial law and ended elections. I noted that people are horrified by the continuation of the war and the deaths. The guest concluded that Zelensky is a construct, a created entity like Epstein. Despite all this dark information, we ended on a note of optimism. The guest said that during the COVID-19 years, he lost a lot of relationships, but he made some of the strongest ones of his life, finding people who were truly courageous. He thanked me for putting my own work on the line, noting that powerful governments didn't like our questions. I reflected on the enormous, unnecessary suffering that was caused, such as the 6 million people who died from regular issues during the COVID years because their families couldn't be with them in the hospital. The guest pointed to the fact that George Orwell's 1984 became the 17th best-selling book in the world in 2021, which shows that a lot of people have their heads screwed on and are starting to become skeptical. Ultimately, the purpose of all this work is to encourage Americans to be skeptical and to use the opportunity they have to resist tyranny.